Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people story. The sound hit me before I even got out of my car. This awful, grinding, metal-on-metal screech coming from my backyard that made my teeth hurt. I had just gotten back from a 3-day business trip, and honestly, all I wanted was to drop my bags, grab a beer, and maybe take a quick dip in my pool before dinner. But that sound meant trouble. I'm an insurance adjuster by trade, which means I spend most of my time looking at things that have gone very, very wrong. When you do this job long enough, you develop a sixth sense for when expensive stuff is about to break. That screaming noise was my pool pump motor running dry, and running dry for what sounded like hours. I dropped my laptop bag right there on the driveway and jogged around the side of the house. What I saw made my stomach drop. My beautiful custom saltwater pool was half empty, not just low, but drained down to the point where you could see the Italian glass tile work that cost me an extra $8,000 during construction. The pump was sucking air through the skimmer, and the motor housing was so hot I could feel the heat radiating off it from 10 feet away. But the real kicker was the bright orange sticker slapped right on my back gate. Safety violation. Corrective action taken by HOA Emergency Authority. Signed by someone called the Safety Compliance Officer, and dated yesterday. Now let me back up a little. When my wife and I moved into this gated community about 18 months ago, we knew we were paying for the privilege. The HOA fees alone could finance a small car, but the amenities were supposed to be worth it. Tennis courts, walking trails, the whole 9 yards. The house came with a basic concrete pool, but I had it completely redone with a high-end PebbleTech finish and a state-of-the-art saltwater system. The filtration setup alone cost more than most people spend on their entire pools. I'll admit, the construction was noisy. 6 weeks of jackhammers, concrete trucks, and general chaos. But I pulled permits for everything, followed every regulation to the letter, and even had the contractors work only during approved hours. Still, I could tell some of the neighbors weren't thrilled. Especially the HOA board president who lived 2 houses down and seemed to take the noise personally. Standing there in my backyard, listening to my pump motor commit suicide, I felt that familiar insurance adjuster calm wash over me. This was a claim situation. Someone had damaged my property and someone was going to pay for it. First things first, though, I needed to shut off that pump before it completely destroyed itself. The electrical panel was in the garage, and I killed the power to the pool equipment. The sudden silence was almost worse than the noise. In the quiet, I could hear water still dripping somewhere, probably from whatever amateur drain job had been done here. I walked around the pool area, taking mental notes. The water level was down about 3 feet, which put it well below the skimmer intake. The salt cell controller was flashing error codes like a Christmas tree. Worst of all, I could see stress cracks starting to form in the tile where the water pressure changes had shifted things around. My phone was buzzing with texts from my wife asking how the trip went, but I ignored them for now. This needed documentation before anything else. I grabbed my camera and started taking pictures of everything. The water level, the orange sticker, the error codes, the stress cracks. In my line of work, you learn that documentation is everything. Without photos, it never happened. That's when my neighbor from across the street, an older guy who I'd only talked to a few times, came walking over. He looked embarrassed and kept glancing around like he was worried about being seen. "Hey there," he said quietly. "I'm really sorry about what happened. I tried to call you, but I didn't have your number." I put down my camera. "You saw what happened?" "Yeah, yesterday afternoon. That lady from the HOA board, the president's wife, she came over with some guy in a pickup truck. They had a hose and one of those little pumps you can rent. Took them about 4 hours to drain it down that far." This was getting interesting. Did they say why they were doing it? He shook his head. "She just said something about emergency safety measures, but honestly it looked more like she was mad about something. She kept pointing at your house and talking real animated-like to the guy with the truck." I thanked him and asked if he'd be willing to write down what he saw. He said sure, he didn't think what they did was right anyway. In insurance, witness statements are gold, especially ones from neutral third parties. After he left, I sat down on my patio furniture and really looked at the situation. The pool damage was obvious and expensive. That salt cell system cost $4,000, and it definitely wasn't designed to run dry. The pump motor was probably shot too. But there was something else nagging at me about this whole setup. I walked around to the back of my property line where the pool equipment pad was located. That's when I found it. A garden hose, still connected to one of my spigots, snaking through the fence and disappearing into the protected wetland area behind our neighborhood. They'd dumped thousands of gallons of chemically treated salt water directly into what was essentially a nature preserve. Now, most people don't know this, but dumping pool water isn't like emptying a kiddie pool. Saltwater pools use a specific chemical balance, including calcium hypochlorite and sodium chloride, at levels that can seriously mess with natural water systems. Dumping that into a wetland isn't just environmentally stupid, it's straight up illegal in most places. And our HOA covenant specifically mentioned that our neighborhood backed up to protected land. I took more pictures, the hose connection, the drainage path, everything. Then I went inside and started making phone calls. The first call was to the HOA management company. Not the board president, but the actual management firm that handled day-to-day operations. I wanted to establish a paper trail. Good afternoon. This is the management office. Hi, this is OP from house number on the east side. I just got back from a business trip and found that my pool has been drained and my equipment damaged. I have a safety violation notice signed by someone called the safety compliance officer. Can you help me understand what happened? There was a pause, then some typing. Let me pull up your file. Oh yes, we received a complaint about your pool being a safety hazard due to high water levels during the recent storm. The board authorized emergency remediation under Section 4.2 of the community bylaws. Emergency remediation? Can you tell me who performed this work? Was it a licensed pool service? More typing. I don't have those details in the system. You'd need to speak with the board president directly about the specific actions taken. And who's the safety compliance officer who signed this notice? That would be the board president's designee for safety matters. Of course it was. I thanked them and hung up, then looked up the number for the board president. Time to have a more direct conversation. She answered on the second ring, and her voice had that fake, cheerful tone that customer service people use when they're trying to avoid responsibility. Oh, hi there. I was wondering when you'd call. I hope you understand that we had to take quick action for everyone's safety. I understand you drained my pool and damaged my equipment, I said, keeping my voice level. Can you explain what safety issue required this emergency action? Well, as I'm sure you know, we had quite a storm last week, and your pool water level was dangerously high. Standing water like that creates an attractive nuisance, especially with children in the neighborhood. We received an anonymous complaint and felt we had no choice but to act quickly. This was interesting. We'd had maybe an inch of rain the week before, barely enough to top off the pool level. And since when was a properly maintained pool an attractive nuisance? I see. And who performed this drainage work? We hired a qualified contractor to address the situation promptly. Can you provide me with the contractor's information? I'll need it for my insurance claim. Her tone shifted slightly, getting a little sharper. Insurance claim? Oh, I don't think that's necessary. The community acted well within our authority under the safety bylaws. You should really be thanking us for preventing a potential liability issue. So you're not planning to compensate me for the damaged equipment? Look, I understand you might be a little upset, but we're all neighbors here. Sometimes we have to make decisions that aren't popular but are necessary for the community. I'm sure a team player like you understands that. Maybe this is a good opportunity to upgrade your pool system to something more neighborhood appropriate anyway. That last comment told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't about safety at all. This was personal, probably related to the construction noise from last year. The fake nice tone was still there, but now there was something else underneath it. Smugness. I understand, I said finally. I'll be sure to follow the exact safety protocols from here on out. I'm so glad you're being reasonable about this. I'll make sure the board knows how cooperative you've been. After I hung up, I sat there for a minute processing what had just happened. In my job, I deal with people trying to avoid responsibility all the time, but this was next-level denial. They damaged thousands of dollars worth of equipment, probably violated environmental regulations, and were expecting me to just roll over and thank them for it. But here's the thing about being an insurance adjuster. You learn that there's always more than one way to approach a problem. Most people, when they get screwed over like this, they get emotional. They start yelling, threaten to sue, make a big scene. The problem with that approach is that it puts the other side on guard and makes them dig in harder. The smart play was to let them think they'd won while I quietly built a case that would hit them from directions they never saw coming. I spent the rest of the evening researching. First, I pulled out my copy of the HOA covenants and bylaws. Section 4.2 was indeed about safety, but it was written pretty broadly. However, there was language requiring proper notice to homeowners except in cases of immediate danger to life and limb. Hard to argue that a properly functioning pool constituted immediate danger. More importantly, the bylaws required that any corrective action be performed by licensed professionals and that the cost be assessed to the homeowner only after proper documentation of the violation. They'd skipped both of those steps, but the real gold mine was in the environmental regulations. Our state had pretty strict rules about discharging pool water, especially saltwater systems. The water had to be dechlorinated and could only be discharged into proper drainage systems, definitely not into wetlands or natural areas. The fines for improper discharge started at $10,000 for the first offense and went up from there. I also looked up the requirements for modifying pool equipment. Technically, what they'd done by draining the pool and affecting the filtration system required a permit from the county. They'd performed unpermitted work on a residential property without the owner's consent. By the time my wife got home from her book club, I had a plan. She found me in my office with legal documents spread all over the desk and a notepad covered in phone numbers. "How was your trip?" she asked, then noticed my expression. "What happened?" I explained the situation, showing her the photos and the documentation I'd gathered. She got angrier than I was, which is saying something. "They can't just do that. It's our property." Actually, they can under certain circumstances. The HOA agreement gives them some emergency powers, but they have to follow specific procedures and they have to be acting in good faith for actual safety reasons. "So what are you going to do?" I leaned back in my chair and smiled. "I'm going to file one complaint." She looked confused. "One complaint? That's it?" "Trust me, it's going to be the right one." The next morning, I started making phone calls. Not to lawyers, not to the media, not even back to the HOA. Instead, I called the Environmental Protection Agency's Regional Enforcement Division. "EPA Enforcement, this is Agent Martinez. Hi, I'd like to report an illegal discharge of chemically treated water into a protected wetland area. Can you hold, please, while I get you to the right department?" 20 minutes later, I was talking to someone who knew exactly what I was describing and was very interested in the details. Apparently, they'd been having problems with HOA communities thinking environmental regulations didn't apply to them. They asked me to email photos and documentation and mention that they'd probably want to send someone out to test the soil and water in the affected area. "Just so you know," the investigator told me, "penalties for this type of violation start at $10,000 for individuals, but for organizations like HOAs, we typically see fines in the $50,000 to $100,000 range, depending on the extent of contamination and whether we find evidence of willful negligence." $50,000 to $100,000? For a community of about 200 homes, that was going to sting. But I wasn't done yet. The next call was to the county building department. "Building permits and inspections. Hi. I need to report unpermitted work performed on a residential property." This conversation was shorter, but equally productive. Modifying pool systems required permits, full stop. The fact that an HOA had authorized the work didn't matter. They weren't licensed contractors and hadn't pulled the proper paperwork. Someone would be out to inspect the situation within a week. The third call was to the HOA's insurance company. This was the tricky one, because I needed to be careful about how I approached it. I wasn't calling to file a claim yet. I was calling to report a potential liability exposure. "Claims Department, this is Jennifer." "Hi, I'm calling to report a situation involving one of your insured HOA communities that might create a liability exposure for you." "What type of situation?" "Property damage and potential environmental violations. I'm an insurance professional myself, so I understand how these things can escalate quickly if they're not handled properly." That got her attention. I explained the basic facts without getting too specific about my plans. Property damage, environmental discharge, unpermitted work. The kind of thing that could turn into an expensive mess if it wasn't resolved quickly. "Can you hold while I pull up the policy information?" 5 minutes later, she was back on the line with a lot more questions. Who was involved? What was the extent of damage? Had any government agencies been notified? I answered honestly but carefully, making sure she understood that this was an evolving situation that could get much more complicated very quickly. "Sir, I appreciate you bringing this to our attention. We're going to need to notify the HOA board immediately about this potential exposure. They'll need to contact our claims department directly." Perfect. Now the insurance company was going to start asking the HOA questions they weren't prepared to answer. The final call was back to my neighbor who'd witnessed the drainage work. I asked if he'd be willing to write a short statement about what he'd seen and when. He said sure, and we agreed that he'd drop it off that evening. By lunchtime, I had set 4 different wheels in motion: environmental enforcement, building code enforcement, insurance liability, and witness documentation. Now came the hardest part: waiting. I spent the afternoon getting quotes for pool repair. The salt cell system was definitely shot. The controller had burned out trying to maintain chemical balance with no water flowing through it. The pump motor was making grinding noises that meant the bearings were gone. Worst of all, the stress cracks in the Italian glass tile meant that entire sections would need to be replaced, and matching the color was going to be challenging since it was a custom blend. All told, I was looking at somewhere between $15,000 and $20,000 in damage. For comparison, the HOA's annual budget for landscape maintenance was only about $12,000. The next few days were quiet on the HOA front, but busy everywhere else. The EPA investigator showed up Thursday morning with soil and water testing equipment. I watched from my kitchen window as they took samples from multiple spots in the wetland area and along the drainage path. They spent about 3 hours documenting everything and asked if they could come back the next week for follow-up testing. The county building inspector was less dramatic, but equally thorough. He spent an hour looking at the pool equipment and taking photos of the modifications that had been made. Before leaving, he taped a bright yellow stop work order to my equipment pad, explaining that all work had to halt until proper permits were obtained and the modifications were either approved or reversed. "Who's responsible for pulling the permits?" I asked. "Whoever authorized the work. If it was the HOA, they're on the hook for making it right." Friday afternoon, I got a call from someone I didn't recognize. "This is calling from the law firm of Smith & Associates. We represent the HOA board, and we understand there may be some concerns about recent maintenance work performed on your property." Interesting. They'd lawyered up already. That suggested the insurance company had indeed started asking uncomfortable questions. "I'm not sure what you mean by concerns," I said. "Are you referring to the property damage?" "We'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss the situation and see if we can reach an amicable resolution." "What kind of resolution?" "Well, obviously the HOA wants to do right by all community members. Perhaps we could arrange for some compensation for any inconvenience you've experienced." Inconvenience. Like this was a delayed pizza delivery instead of thousands of dollars in damage. "I appreciate the call," I told him, "but right now I'm waiting for some inspections to be completed before I can fully assess the situation." "What inspections?" "Oh, just some routine follow-up work by the county and state. You know how these things go." There was a pause. "State inspections?" "Nothing to worry about, I'm sure. Just some environmental testing in the wetland area. Probably just routine." Another pause. Longer this time. "Environmental testing?" "Yeah, apparently when you discharge pool water into protected areas, they like to make sure there's no contamination. Standard procedure." I could practically hear him taking notes. "We'll be in touch," he said, and hung up. Saturday morning brought the first crack in the HOA's confidence. I was outside checking my mail when the board president drove by. Instead of her usual friendly wave, she slowed down and rolled down her window. "I understand you've been talking to some government agencies," she said. The fake nice tone was completely gone now. "Just following proper procedures," I replied. "You know, being a good neighbor and all. Look, maybe we can work something out here. Nobody wants this to become a big legal thing." "Legal thing? I thought this was just routine safety maintenance." She was quiet for a minute, clearly trying to figure out how much I knew and how much trouble they were actually in. "The board might be willing to cover some of your repair costs, as a gesture of goodwill." "Some of the costs?" "Well, maybe all of them, and perhaps a little extra for your trouble." Now we were getting somewhere, but I'd learned a long time ago that the first offer is never the best offer, especially when the other side is starting to panic. "That's very generous," I said. "But like I told your lawyer, I'm waiting for the inspections to be finished before I can really assess everything." "Lawyer? What lawyer?" "Oops. Maybe they had multiple lawyers and the left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing, or maybe she didn't know the board had consulted with attorneys yet. Someone from Smith & Associates called yesterday, said he represented the HOA board." Her face went through several color changes before settling on pale green. "I need to make some phone calls," she said, and drove off without another word. Sunday was quiet, but Monday morning brought news that changed everything. I was getting ready for work when my phone rang. EPA investigator. "Mr. OP, I wanted to give you a heads up about our test results. The soil and water samples from the wetland area show significant contamination from pool chemicals. Chlorine levels that are toxic to plant and animal life, plus elevated sodium that's going to kill vegetation over a wide area." "How wide an area?" Based on the drainage pattern and the volume of water involved, we're looking at contamination affecting approximately 2 acres of protected wetland. This is going to trigger our serious violator protocols. Serious violator protocols. Federal enforcement action. Criminal referrals. The works. Whoever authorized this discharge is looking at felony environmental crimes, not just civil fines. Felony charges. This had just escalated from an expensive mistake to a potential criminal matter. There's something else, the investigator continued. The discharge point shows evidence of multiple previous incidents. This wasn't a one-time thing. Multiple incidents? I hadn't considered that possibility, but it made sense. If they were willing to drain my pool illegally, they'd probably done similar things to other homeowners who crossed them. We're going to need a formal statement from you about what happened and when. Can you come in this week? I arranged to meet with them Wednesday afternoon and hung up feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and concern. Satisfaction because the evidence was backing up everything I'd suspected. Concern because this was spiraling into something much bigger than a simple property damage dispute. Tuesday brought another call, this one from the HOA's insurance company. Mr. OP, this is Jennifer from the claims department. We spoke last week about a potential liability exposure involving your HOA. Yes, I remember. I need to inform you that as of this morning, we've placed the HOA's liability coverage under review due to potential environmental violations and criminal activity. We're also opening a formal investigation into the property damage claim. What does that mean for the HOA? It means their coverage is suspended pending resolution of the environmental and criminal issues. Any new claims or incidents won't be covered until this matter is resolved. No coverage. In an HOA community, that was a death sentence. Without liability insurance, the community couldn't operate, homeowners couldn't sell their properties, and banks wouldn't approve mortgages or refinancing. How long does this kind of review usually take? Depends on how quickly the underlying issues are resolved. If criminal charges are filed, it could be months or even years. Wednesday afternoon, I gave my formal statement to the EPA investigators. 3 hours of detailed questions about what I'd found, when I'd found it, and what evidence I had. They were particularly interested in the witness statement from my neighbor and the photos I'd taken. Based on your professional experience, one of them asked, do you believe this was an intentional act of environmental destruction? That was a loaded question. Intent was the difference between civil penalties and criminal charges. Based on the evidence, it appears that the responsible parties knew or should have known that their actions would result in illegal discharge into protected waters. Whether that constitutes intent would be for a prosecutor to determine. They seemed satisfied with that answer. Thursday morning, everything exploded. I was sitting at my desk at work when my phone started buzzing with texts from neighbors. The first one just said, "Holy crap, did you see what's happening at the HOA office?" The second one was a photo of 2 government cars parked outside the community center, along with what looked like a sheriff's deputy. I called the neighbor who'd sent the photo. "What's going on over there?" "Federal agents, man. They showed up about an hour ago with a bunch of boxes and paperwork. Looked like they were serving some kind of warrant or something. The HOA president was there too, and she did not look happy." A federal warrant. This was moving faster than I'd expected. I was about to call it a day and head home to see what was happening when my office phone rang. "Mr. OP, this is Attorney Johnson from Smith & Associates. We need to talk immediately." The panic in his voice was pretty obvious. "What can I do for you?" "My clients have been served with federal search warrants related to environmental crimes. They're also facing potential criminal charges. We need to discuss a resolution to your property damage claim immediately. I told your office that I was waiting for inspections to be completed. The inspections are completed. The EPA has referred this matter to the U.S. Attorney for prosecution. My clients are looking at potentially millions of dollars in fines plus criminal exposure. We need to settle your claim now, before this gets any worse. Millions of dollars in fines. For a community HOA that operated on a budget of maybe $200,000 a year, that was extinction-level debt. What kind of settlement are you talking about? Full restoration of your property to better than original condition, plus substantial compensation for your inconvenience and distress. We're also prepared to remove the safety bylaw that was used to justify the original action, and to ensure that the board members responsible for this situation are permanently removed from their positions. Better than original condition, plus substantial compensation, removal of the safety bylaw, permanent removal of the board members. They were offering me everything I wanted and more. But here's the thing about negotiations. When the other side is desperate, they're usually willing to offer even more than what they've put on the table. That sounds reasonable in principle, I said, but I'd need to see some specifics before I could consider it. How quickly could we arrange a meeting? Well, I'm supposed to meet with the federal prosecutors next week to discuss my cooperation in their case. Maybe we should talk before then. Dead silence on the other end of the line. Your cooperation in their case? Oh yes, I'm a key witness for the prosecution. They've asked me to provide expert testimony about the insurance implications and the cover-up efforts. More silence. Cover-up efforts was probably not something he wanted to hear, but the insurance angle was what would really scare them. If federal prosecutors could show that the HOA had tried to conceal environmental crimes from their insurance company, that opened up additional fraud charges. We could meet tomorrow, he said finally. Let me check my schedule and get back to you. After I hung up, I sat back and thought about what had just happened. In less than a week, a simple property damage dispute had turned into a federal criminal case that threatened to destroy the entire HOA. The board members were facing potential felony charges, the community was looking at millions in fines, and the insurance situation meant that every homeowner in the neighborhood was now at risk. And all because they'd decided to drain my pool out of spite. I called my wife to fill her in on the latest developments. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Now we get our pool fixed, our property value restored, and we make sure this never happens to anyone else." "And the people who did this?" I looked out my office window at the city skyline and smiled. "I think they're about to learn why you never mess with someone who understands insurance." The meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon at the lawyer's office. I spent Thursday evening reviewing my documentation and preparing for what I expected would be a very interesting conversation. But first, I had one more phone call to make. EPA Investigations, this is Agent Martinez. "Hi, this is OP. I understand you served search warrants yesterday on the HOA board members?" "Yes, and thank you for your cooperation. Your evidence was crucial in establishing probable cause. I wanted you to know that the HOA's attorneys have reached out about settling the property damage claim. They're obviously trying to limit their exposure. That's not unusual, but I want you to know that any settlement you reach won't affect our criminal investigation. These are serious environmental crimes, and we're going to prosecute them fully regardless of any civil settlements." "I understand. I just wanted you to know that they're clearly aware of the severity of the situation." "Good. The more pressure they feel, the more likely they are to cooperate with our investigation." Friday afternoon, I drove to the law offices of Smith & Associates. It was one of those glass and chrome downtown buildings that charge by the square foot just for the address. Someone was definitely paying serious money for legal representation. The conference room had 6 people in it when I arrived. 2 lawyers, the HOA board president and her husband, and 2 other board members I didn't recognize. The mood was somewhere between funeral wake and hostage negotiation. "Mr. OP, thank you for coming," Attorney Johnson said. "I think we can resolve this situation in a way that benefits everyone." I sat down and pulled out my notebook. I'm listening. "First, complete restoration of your pool area. Not just repair, but upgrading to whatever specifications you choose. New equipment, new finishes, whatever you want. That's a start. Second, compensation for your inconvenience and distress. We're thinking $50,000. $50,000. Not bad, but probably not their final offer. Third, removal of Safety Bylaw 4.2 from the community covenants, and a commitment that no similar actions will be taken against any homeowner without proper notice and due process. And fourth, the board members responsible for this situation will resign their positions and be permanently barred from serving in any HOA leadership role in the community." I looked around the table. The board president was staring at her hands. Her husband looked like he was going to be sick. The other 2 board members were trying very hard not to make eye contact with anyone. "Those all sound like steps in the right direction," I said. "But I'm curious about the timing." "Timing?" "Well, you're facing federal criminal charges, millions of dollars in EPA fines. Your insurance has been canceled. How exactly are you planning to pay for pool restoration and compensation when you might not even exist as an organization in 6 months?" Attorney Johnson glanced at his clients before answering. "The board has voted to authorize a special assessment against all homeowners to cover these costs. A special assessment. That meant every homeowner in the community was going to get a bill to cover the costs of the board's illegal activities. For a settlement package that could easily hit $150,000, that was going to be some serious money per household. And the homeowners have agreed to this? The board has the authority to impose special assessments for emergency expenses." "I see. And have you disclosed to the homeowners that this emergency was caused by illegal environmental crimes committed by the board?" Uncomfortable shuffling around the table. "The legal issues are separate from the HOA operations," one of the other lawyers said. "Are they?" Because from what I understand, the criminal charges are directly related to actions the board took in their official capacity, actions that violated federal environmental law and caused significant property damage. "Look," the board president said suddenly, speaking for the first time since I'd arrived. "We made a mistake. Maybe we didn't handle things the right way, but we're trying to make it right now." "A mistake? You trespassed on my property, destroyed thousands of dollars in equipment, and dumped toxic chemicals into a protected wetland. That's not a mistake. That's a crime spree." She flinched at that, but I wasn't done. "And then when I called to ask about it, you told me I should be grateful. You said I should be a team player. You suggested I was being unreasonable for wanting my property restored. We were trying to protect the community." Protect the community from what? A properly maintained pool that was in full compliance with all regulations? No answer to that. "Here's what I think happened," I continued. "I think you were still mad about the construction noise from last year. I think you saw an opportunity to cause me some expensive problems and you took it. I think you figured I'd just eat the costs and keep my mouth shut to avoid conflict. That's not... And I think when it became clear that this was going to be a much bigger problem than you expected, you decided to try to buy your way out of it with other people's money." I looked around the table again. These people had no idea how much trouble they were actually in. "So here's my counter-proposal," I said, pulling out my own folder of documents. "First, complete restoration of my property, but using contractors of my choice and with work supervised by my inspector. No cutting corners, no shortcuts, no more amateur hour. Second, compensation for damages, inconvenience, and punitive purposes, $100,000. The lawyers started to object, but I held up my hand. Third, the HOA pays for an independent environmental remediation of the entire wetland area, certified by the EPA and guaranteed for 10 years. That could cost millions, yes. Which brings me to my fourth point. I slid a document across the table. The resignation of the entire board, permanent prohibition from any future HOA service, and personal financial responsibility for any criminal fines or penalties. No special assessments to the homeowners for costs related to this situation. Dead silence. And finally, a complete restructuring of the HOA bylaws to prevent this kind of abuse from ever happening again, including independent oversight and a homeowner bill of rights. Attorney Johnson was skimming through the document I'd provided. "These terms are completely unreasonable. You're essentially asking them to accept personal bankruptcy. I'm asking them to take responsibility for their criminal actions instead of passing the costs on to innocent homeowners." "And if they don't agree?" I smiled and pulled out another document. "Then I'll be testifying for the prosecution at their criminal trial, and I'll be supporting the EPA's restitution claims, and I'll be encouraging every homeowner in the community to sue the board members personally for the loss of property values caused by their criminal conduct." I stood up and gathered my papers. "Oh, and I'll be recommending that the U.S. Attorney investigate the attempted cover-up and fraud conspiracy that started the minute you tried to blame this on anonymous complaints and emergency safety measures." "Wait," the board president said. "You can't just..." "I can, and I will. You had the chance to handle this right from the beginning. You chose to lie, cover up, and try to bully me into accepting responsibility for your crimes. Now you get to deal with the consequences." I headed for the door, then turned back. "You have until Monday to respond to my proposal. After that, I'm done negotiating." On my way out, I could hear raised voices from the conference room. Not my problem anymore. Saturday morning, I was working in my garage when I heard a car pull up in the driveway. Through the window, I could see it was the board president, alone this time. She sat in her car for several minutes before getting out and walking to my front door. My wife answered the door and called for me. When I came out, the board president looked like she'd been crying. "Can we talk?" she asked. "Please?" We sat on my front porch, and for the first time since this whole thing started, she seemed like an actual human being instead of a bureaucratic nightmare. "I want you to know that I never intended for any of this to happen," she began. "When we drained your pool, I thought we were just teaching you a lesson about being considerate of your neighbors." "A lesson?" "The construction noise last year, it was really disruptive. My husband works nights and the jackhammers woke him up every day for weeks. We asked you to consider limiting the hours, but you said you were following the rules." "I was following the rules, and I did limit the hours to what was allowed." "I know, but it was still hard on us. And then you had this beautiful expensive pool and it felt like you were just showing off." I looked at her for a minute. "So you decided to destroy my equipment and dump chemicals in a wetland?" "It wasn't supposed to be that bad. We just wanted to inconvenience you a little bit, make you understand what it felt like to have your peace disrupted." And the environmental damage? I didn't know about the wetland thing. I thought we were just draining water into a storm drain. She was quiet for a moment, then looked up at me. I know you probably can't forgive me, but I need you to know that I understand how wrong this was, and I'm willing to accept whatever consequences come from it. Even personal bankruptcy? Even that. My husband and I have talked about it, and we'd rather lose everything than see the other homeowners suffer for our mistakes. This was not what I'd been expecting. For the past week, I'd been dealing with lawyers and bureaucrats and defensive, evasive responses. This was the first time anyone had actually acknowledged what had really happened and taken full responsibility for it. What about the other board members? They're scared. They think if they fight hard enough, they can make this go away. They don't understand that it's too late for that. And you do understand? I think so. I think we crossed a line that can't be uncrossed, and now we have to pay for it. I thought about that for a minute. Justice wasn't just about punishment, it was also about accountability and making things right. Here's what I'm willing to do, I said finally. If you and your husband take full personal responsibility for this situation, and if you cooperate completely with the federal investigation, I'll work with you on a settlement that doesn't destroy everyone else in the community. What does that mean? It means I'll accept a payment plan for the damages instead of demanding everything up front. It means I'll support environmental remediation that's effective but not necessarily gold-plated. And it means I won't encourage other homeowners to sue you personally. And in return? You resign from the board immediately. You cooperate with law enforcement. You pay for my property restoration and a reasonable compensation package. And you help me make sure this never happens to anyone else. She was crying again, but she nodded. There's one more thing, I said. The next time you have a problem with a neighbor, you talk to them like an adult instead of trying to punish them. I promise. Monday morning, I got a call from Attorney Johnson. My clients have accepted your revised proposal, he said. We're prepared to move forward with the settlement immediately. Revised proposal? The one you discussed with Mrs. Harrison over the weekend. Mrs. Harrison. I finally had a name for the board president. Good. When can we finalize the paperwork? This week, if possible. The federal prosecutors want to know about any settlements before they finalize their charges. 2 weeks later, I was standing in my backyard watching a crew install a brand new pool system that was significantly nicer than what I'd had before. The PebbleTech finish was being replaced with an even more expensive aggregate that looked like crushed glass in the sunlight. The salt cell system was top of the line, with automation features I'd only dreamed about. The environmental remediation was happening in the wetland area behind the house, with EPA supervision and monitoring. Mrs. Harrison had been true to her word about cooperating with the investigation, which had resulted in federal charges against 2 other board members, but a plea agreement for her that involved community service and restitution instead of prison time. The special assessment to homeowners was minimal, just enough to cover the increased insurance costs while the community rebuilt its reputation. The HOA bylaws had been completely rewritten with input from a homeowner committee, and the new board had a completely different approach to community management. My wife found me out there one evening watching the new pool system cycle through its cleaning routine. "So was it worth it?" she asked. I thought about that for a minute. The money was nice and the pool was definitely an upgrade. But what felt best was knowing that no other homeowner in the community would have to deal with the kind of abuse we'd experienced. "Yeah," I said finally. "I think it was." "What's the water like?" I checked the digital display on the new control system. Temperature, chemical levels, filtration status, everything perfectly balanced and automated. "Perfect," I said. "Just like the scales of justice." She laughed and went inside to start dinner. I stayed out there a little longer, watching the sun set behind the trees and listening to the quiet hum of properly functioning equipment. Sometimes the best revenge is just making sure the bad guys face the consequences of their actions. And sometimes, if you're really lucky, you get a nice pool upgrade out of it too. The water was indeed perfectly balanced, in every sense of the word. The next one is a malicious compliance story, so my Spotify Premium renewed today because I forgot to cancel. I immediately checked their refund policy online and confirmed I was eligible, so I canceled the plan, literally within minutes, and hopped on support chat to ask for the refund. Seemed simple, right? Wrong. The agent, Christina, gave me the classic runaround. She said the 14-day refund period only applies to your initial sign-up, and since I'd been a member for months, I was out of luck. She even sent me a link to the policy to prove her point, telling me to read it. This is where the malicious compliance comes in. I did exactly what she said. I read the policy, and then I went deeper and found their full, legally binding terms of use. And what did I find? In Section 3, under Withdrawal Right, it clearly states you have 14 days after your purchase to withdraw for any reason. A monthly renewal is a new purchase. My own research before the chat was correct. I went back to Christina and quoted the terms of use directly. She put me on hold to check backstage, then came back with the same denial. Her team was doubling down on the incorrect script, so I played my final card. I sent this message. Since this dispute is specifically about the legal interpretation of the withdrawal right in your terms of use, could you please provide the contact information for Spotify's legal department or the appropriate office for handling formal contractual disputes? The change was instant. Suddenly, she had to see what she could do. 5 minutes later, I've managed to ask some support with our backstage team, and we can go ahead and process a refund for you. They folded like a cheap suit. Their business model counts on you giving up. Don't. You are entitled to your money back. Anyway, thank you for watching.